Much, Henry, and thanks very much for inviting me. Congratulations on today's conference. I think it's really well timed. We've had the referendum result since the early hours of June the 24th last year. And so, that was the moment, I think, whichever side people were on, to say to people it's time to come together and work out how we now get the best Brexit. For Britain, I'm not sure everyone got there the following day, but I think it is this month actually, that the debate does decisively move on because the process hadn't started. That is one reason, I think, why people on both sides kept refighting the campaign that they'd fought last summer. But now it's real. And the question of what Brexit means is really what it's all about. So thanks for inviting me to be part of today's event and to talk about what should Brexit mean for immigration. And I want to say there's an opportunity here for a surprising, perhaps, new consensus on this issue. Take back control and global Britain are the two key messages of Brexit, the slogan of the winning campaign, the vision of the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech that will inform her negotiations. And people often say those are going to be difficult to bring together. Is there a core tension over Brexit here? Does one sound as though it promises more protection and the other more change? We obviously know that when 17 million people voted to leave, they come from very different ends of a sort of open and closed debate. And for the government to make a success of Brexit, it now needs to show how to reconcile those ideas of control and openness. And this is, I think, thought to be especially difficult on immigration because it was the most polarising issue of that referendum campaign. So I want to address that challenge this afternoon. How do we bring the two together? I think it will be challenging, of course, but it will not be impossible. And in fact, finding that common ground on immigration, I think, will be one of the keys to finally moving the debate about Brexit beyond the referendum trenches of the campaign that was fought last year in 2016. So we have this new Brexit Together phase of the debate, which challenges not just the 52% who voted for Brexit, but everyone on the 48% who wants to make it work, to now find a shared stake in what are the future choices we make now. Now, there will, I think, have to be changes on immigration because Brexit is a reset moment for immigration policy in Britain. And that's because the Leave vote did reflect a significant loss of public confidence in how successive governments have managed immigration in this country over the last couple of decades. The Labour governments failed to predict, prepare for, or respond to effectively the largest migration wave in British history after the eastward expansion of the EU in 2004. The Conservative-led successor governments therefore pledged to reduce the net migration numbers, but they went up instead. So that meant every quarter statistics, there were new headlines about how the government had made a promise it wasn't keeping. That's why I think the public expect to see some significant changes to immigration policy after Brexit. But the first thing to be clear about is that most people blame the politicians, not the migrants themselves. This is not a country of xenophobes. People are sceptical about the pace and scale of immigration, and they also recognise the gains that immigration, when we manage it well, brings to Britain. So there's a public desire for more control, but certainly not for an indiscriminate immigration crackdown, and absolutely not for xenophobic mistreatment of Europeans who've come here. And the post-referendum research that British Future has been doing on people's attitudes and views captures very clearly that it combines frustration with the status quo and what hasn't worked well in the past with a pragmatic, moderate, nuanced mix of views about the choices we now face to manage migration. And they highlight as well some of the key policy choices we'll all have to make. Let me just highlight a few of the examples. 84% of people believe the European nationals in Britain must remain welcome here. So they urgently need a guarantee of their right to stay and settle and to end the anxiety they face. But we need to be really clear, that's a common ground view of the vast majority of voters on both sides of this referendum. So if there's an idiotic, racist fringe minority who have a deluded belief that 17 million of their fellow citizens voted to kick people out or send them home, they need to be firmly put back in their box by all of us. At the same time, a clear two-thirds majority would like to see fewer unskilled workers coming in future. Low-skilled immigration from Europe is a key area where people expect change, so that Britain controls the pace and the scale of the low and semi-skilled immigration that comes in. However, even within this category, there's quite a difference of views, actually, about different areas of low and semi-skilled immigration across sectors. Only about a quarter of the public say we should reduce people coming into work for care homes. About half would do so for work in hospitality. So there are very different views even within that. How far, therefore, will it be sensible for government to differentiate in policy between different sectors of the economy? Only a fifth of people would like to cut skilled or student migration. Most people would like the numbers, more people would like the numbers of migrant nurses, doctors, scientists, students to increase, and most are content with current levels. So if we had a responsive popular migration policy, it might reflect the broad popularity of both student and skilled migration. So, should the government target net migration as a whole, or perhaps take a less one-size-fits-all approach? Could we make more differentiations by skills in our immigration policy? And could our immigration policy and our domestic skills strategy be coherently combined together so that we deal with both issues? Finally, 7 out of 10 people think we should maintain our tradition of offering sanctuary to refugees who need it. Now, we shouldn't be surprised by this. Britain's commitment to the Refugee Convention was ratified by Winston Churchill's government in 1951, decades before we thought about joining the European community, still less leaving it 40 years later. So most of us, I think that the idea of global Britain will mean maintaining that principle of refugee protection for those who need it after Brexit. So there's the mix of views. There is, in that nuanced public view, an opportunity for a new pragmatic consensus, but that would challenge both sides of the traditional immigration argument we've been having. Those people who want to defend the economic and social gains immigration brings to Britain need to rise to the challenge. How do we rebuild public confidence in it? That means paying much more attention to practical approaches to properly managing the impacts of the immigration that we do choose to keep, and much more to promoting successful integration in our country. Now, at the same time, those who have been sceptical of the scale and pace of immigration also need to move on from critiquing the past failures of government policy to coming up with their workable plans for reducing immigration in ways that do recognise the needs of the economy and the public services. So it challenges both wings of the polarised immigration debate, but it does it in a way that reflects the common ground in public opinion. Because out there in the country, most people do not see immigration as a binary yes or no, for or against position, open or closed. They see it as something we need to manage well to get it right. Now, it's definitely the case that committed Remain and Leave voters saw the overall political priorities differently. That was reflected in the campaign preference for the single market and controlling immigration. What we always underestimate is the vast amount of common ground that actually exists between voters on both sides of the referendum. The less partisan halves of the 17 million and the 16 million, they were the people who spent the last 3 months deciding how to vote in the referendum. They were the people who decided it. They've got much more in common with each other across the referendum choice they made than with the most restless social media keyboard warriors on the side that they happen to come down on the side of. So that's why the idea that Brexit is a reset moment for immigration is not confined to the 52% who voted to leave, actually. It's a view shared by most of the voters on the other side too. And you could sum up this consensus as the public see it in an argument that British Future put in a public attitude survey very soon after the referendum result, the following week, just to find out how many people thought this broad vision struck the right kind of note. This is the proposition we put. Immigration brings pressures as well as gains. Our decision to leave the EU gives us a chance to change the system. What we need now is a sensible policy to manage immigration so we control who comes here, but still keep the immigration that's good for our economy and society and maintains our transition of offering sanctuary to refugees who need our protection. 3/4 of people agree with that. 8% of people say they oppose it. It's a common ground consensus which combines 84% of Leave and Conservative voters and finds 69% of people who voted Remain in the referendum agreeing with a statement backed by 8 out of 10 people who vote UKIP. Now, I'm very clear that turning a broadly shared aspiration for the goals and objectives of post-Brexit immigration policy into a workable policy that you implement that makes political and economic sense is going to be difficult. People who like the idea will have different ideas about its content. But if a government can show its post-Brexit immigration reform struck that pragmatic balance, they would be speaking to a common ground majority in this country that went across the referendum divide. And that's the new debate that is just now starting. And if we're going to get that right, what's the new policy now? What should we do now? Not do you like it or not? How do we handle it? This referendum cannot mark the end of public engagement in shaping immigration policy. So my organisation, British Future, is currently engaged in one of the largest ever exercises in public engagement on any issue. The National Conversation in Immigration involves us holding 120 meetings in 60 towns and cities across every nation and region of the UK, holding citizens panels, holding events with policy stakeholders, not on what policy do you want, but how can you contribute to the common ground? Can we find a consensus? And our National Conversation findings about how the public see the choices, the challenges, are feeding into the Home Affairs Committee, who are holding an inquiry on what does an immigration policy that can secure public confidence look like? So I hope to have some new ideas if I see you in a year's time from all of that engagement. But today I just want to look at a couple of one of the big choices about how we approach EU and non-EU immigration after free movement. What's a global Britain approach to this? Now, the Prime Minister and Home Secretary have been very clear. Free movement as we know it will end after Brexit. What nobody yet knows is, does that mean similar rules for European and non-EU migrants to Britain? Should we have an immigration system in which nationality doesn't matter at all, where the same rules apply to everyone? Now, the fairness intuition in favour of this policy is a pretty strong one. Why should an immigration system automatically prefer an unskilled worker from Spain or Bulgaria to someone with more skills from India? In the other EU member states, you'd be able to explain that. You'd actually say, well, because we are European. And people would say, OK, that's right. But that doesn't feel fair to most people in Britain because there's a much lower level of European identity here than actually in all of the other member states. We've got quite similar views of immigration. We've got different views about European identity and citizenship. And I think the equal treatment of people from any country is the right principle for several types of immigration, which take refugees based on their need to protection, not refuse them because the country they're fleeing happens to be a dangerous one. You get the vetting right, but you take the refugees that need protection. When a Brit wants to marry a foreigner, most people will think the rules shouldn't discriminate by nationality. But should economic migration policies be nationality blind too? Now, here, I think that starts to fail some common sense tests once you try and design a real-world post-Brexit immigration policy around that principle. Here are three problems. Firstly, we've never, ever had that policy in British immigration history, and we'll probably never have it in the future either. And few people notice this, but almost nobody who actually proposes a nationality-blind principle actually sticks consistently to it. Has any mainstream politician in our country said we need immigration controls for Irish citizens after Brexit? Probably not. If the principle is we must treat every country equally, except Ireland is different, then the principle has already started to say some foreign countries are special to Britain. And think again about that free movement debate. Invariably, the complaint about why it felt unfair invariably mentioned India, Pakistan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, or Caribbean countries. I never heard anybody say EU free movement is unfair to, say, Chileans or Ukrainians. So the resonant objection was not we can't have different rules for any country, it was that the special European rules felt unbalanced in terms of other British special relationships that we had and that we should have a better balance between. Here's another challenge. Should we have visa-free travel after Brexit with the European Union? I'll say yes, we should. We need to negotiate it. I think we should expect to succeed. We've got visa-free travel to this country with over 50 countries. The Schengen zone has a different list of 50 or 60 countries. Argentina and Tonga are on both lists. So I think it would be odd, it would be a big failure if Britain and the European Union can't agree this with each other. So I'm in favour of visa-free travel. But it breaches the nationality blind principle because nobody actually argues the only permissible choice is you have visa-free travel with every country or with no country. We actually decide the pace at which we can open that up in our mutual interests. But most importantly at all, an approach that said the same rules for everyone is a core principle that our Brexit immigration policy must adopt would be very bad news for our International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox. Because the logic of that rule is that we'd have to politely turn down any and every offer of a new skilled migration arrangement with the USA, which the government wants to explore, with Australia, with Canada, with India on post-study leave or reciprocal opportunities, however much we thought it was a good deal, unless we could negotiate it at the same time with 200 other countries. Nobody ever says you can't do a trade deal with any country unless you do that trade deal with everybody. However much you're in favour of as much free trade as possible, you get there in the negotiations that you can. To my mind, it makes no more sense to say you can't do an economic migration deal with anybody unless you do it with everybody. So I'm going to say a global Britain approach should be open to negotiating different immigration deals with several other countries or indeed continents, if we think they're in our national interest, but with two crucial tests of this policy. Most importantly of all, you need to have political public consent here in Britain for the migration deal the government wants to strike. Before the government is negotiating abroad, this I think is a big lesson of what Mr Cameron didn't do with his renegotiation, you need a strong political public consensus at home about the migration mix that we're trying to get. Secondly, having worked out what immigration we want here, a global Britain strategy can make how and where we source that immigration from, that can be part of our negotiating hand in the future trade deals we want to strike. So the right thing, I think, to do is to pursue the global Britain strategy in our continent and worldwide. The outcomes of the immigration policy we end up with will depend on the trade deals we get, how the different talks go. So I'm going to argue that a same rules for everyone, for everywhere approach, despite sounding fair, wouldn't be in our national interest. We shouldn't tie Liam Fox's hands when he's negotiating trade deals around the world with the same rules for everyone policy if there's a deal that's good for Britain and that the public like in those specific arrangements. Nor should we tie the hands of the Prime Minister when she goes to Brussels seeking to agree the best Brexit deal for Britain. For me, that wouldn't be cricket. In fact, you could even say it would risk breaking their bats before they take the crease to bat for Britain, as somebody may once have said in another context a long time ago. But let's look at the content of that deal. The UK government, the European talks start first, Article 50 goes in. The UK government is clear we want the closest possible comprehensive free trade deal with the EU, not on the basis of free movement. British Future has proposed a model for European migration that the UK government could put on the table in the talks, if it's part of a broader partnership that we want, and which would marry, crucially, the principles of control and the openness we want. I think Britain should propose maintaining skilled movement, both ways, for those with a job above an agreed skills or salary threshold. At the same time, the UK government should be clear it will introduce controls and limits on the level of low-skilled and semi-skilled migration, and we'll debate what those levels should be. We could, though, be willing to let EU citizens have the first option on the low-skilled immigration we've decided to seek within those limits, if that helps us get a strong tariff-free trade deal of the type the Prime Minister wants. That's not free movement. It's a much tighter EU EEA migration system than we have. It might be attractive, it might not work. What it would do is offer greater access to the British labour market under a controlled system for EU citizens than if there's no deal at all. If there's no deal at all with Europe, then European nationals would have similar rules to non-EU migration, except the Global Britain strategy could then see other trade partners strike deals that would give their citizens preferential migration access to the UK labour market because we'd struck stronger trade deals with those countries. So crucially, for the debate you're having today, in both scenarios, I think we can have new deals with the Commonwealth, with the world beyond, as well as striking the right deal with Europe. If we have that skilled movement deal with Europe, We could supplement it by further skilled and post-study migration deals with the USA, with Commonwealth countries or others, subject to the level of political and public consent in Britain about the overall migration mix. But low-skilled non-EU economic migration will clearly remain heavily restricted as it is now. On the other hand, if there isn't an EU deal, maybe we'd think about a more expansive reciprocal skilled movement deal with Australia, New Zealand, Canada and India, maybe of different kinds, for those taking jobs above the skills and salary thresholds we set. That might be more attractive. If the EU talks were to fail, we'd also need a strategy for our low-skilled and semi-skilled immigration. That could be a nationality-blind quota scheme that Europeans and everyone from around the world can apply for on the same terms, or the government might find that quota-based schemes of particular Commonwealth countries or other trade and development partners might form part of the mix if it made sense. What I think is crucial here, as the government embarks now on this Article 50 process, is it's a chance for a new consensus on immigration. We've got to start by finding the common ground in immigration at home. And once we've done that, the government is in a much stronger position to negotiate in Europe and in the wider world to show it's very possible to combine the principle of control with the global economic engagement that post-Brexit Britain needs. Thank you very much.